Welcome to Breaking Banks. Welcome back to Breaking Banks. Joining us all the way from Honkers, HK, the +852. Don't call it that. We would like to welcome my good mates, Dano and Joe. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah. Now to introduce Dano and Joe, they've spent 24 years in the design research field, founders of the Hong Kong UX group, and most recently have put together a very interesting book that we want to get into today, which is entitled Make Meaningful Work: From Sleepwalking to Sparkle, a learning platform to develop 21st century transferable soft skills. It's out on Amazon right now, so if you want to check it out. But today we thought we'd get into the future of work. Let me start, guys, with, the pandemic obviously produced a significant change in working practices, having us work from home with quarantines and so forth. And in Hong Kong, of course, the quarantine situation has been somewhat tougher than in other places around the world. But having said that, how likely was it that working from home would have become such a big part of working practice without the pandemic, do you think? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think even before the pandemic, in the Hong Kong context, many people bring home their work already for a long time. I think the pandemic just make it like clearer in front of their eyes. It wouldn't surprise me it will happen more.
Yeah. You think now that people have had a taste of working from home, definitely we see now with, Gen Zs in particular, but to some extent with millennials, if an employer is saying, no, you have to come to the office, many of them are just opting out of those jobs and looking for alternatives, whether that is gigging economy work or whether that is looking for employers that allow them more flexibility. And we've had some big names trying, particularly, in the UK and the US, trying to wrangle people back into the office, and that's been fairly unsuccessful, it would appear. So from a cultural shift perspective, do you see this as a permanent change in the way we're working?
From my perspective, so a few things. Like the pandemic was a huge event globally, and I still think people are processing that. Both in terms of the health and wellness aspect of it that can't be avoided, but also the ramifications that it's having socially and economically on people. It's been a huge shift. I mean, when we were going to school, we probably would not have predicted such a future where there would have been a pandemic. And in reference,
you mean last century? When you were going to school last century? Sorry,
when I went to school back in the 16th century.
in the late 20th century. That's how the millennials refer to it, right?
Is that right? When we were still riding bicycles.
Yes. Dodging kangaroos. Yes.
But it's had ramifications on people, on context, and naturally what comes with that is it's had ramifications, impact on behaviour, because we're social beings, so it's going to have impact on behaviour. And part of that shift in a work context has been, now I've been enforced a choice, which I may or may not like, because there was if we recall, there was a friction or a onboarding when it came to working from home as well in the early days. The pandemic.
Right. Yeah.
I've got to be around kids, and I don't particularly want to be around my spouse, and I've got poor internet connection, and I miss my colleagues. But as people shifted and transitioned through that, they got used to this idea of, hey, hang on a minute, maybe maybe there can be another alternative from working in the office to working in another space. I think what it's going to have is we talk about three kind of pillars, I guess, in meaningful work, which is character, leadership, and culture. And I think this shift is going to affect all three. And I'll finish with this because it's a great question. I think we can't apply the same observations to every work context, because I think we're primarily talking about knowledge work, but there's other types of work where people didn't have the choice. They had to go in to work, even with all the safety concerns. So, yeah.
I don't know if you guys know Gary Vaynerchuk, but Gary is a well-known celebrity influencer. Started off with an online wine business and has become sort of a global brand in his own right. But he says that for the younger kids today entering the workforce have so many choices because they get how to, in terms of their digital life, they get and understand the opportunities for gigging work and, side gigs and so forth in that space. And so you're not going to be able to get these kids into a paid salary position for under 100 grand, because if they've got the flexibility of working for themselves, earning 70 or 80 grand on a gigging in a gigging economy sense, why would they come into an office, doing 9 to 5 for a little bit of extra cash? So part of that is what sort of environment are we creating that is challenging, that is exciting, that is flexible? But this is not how Wall Street has helped us as corporations to think about employment and work, particularly if you work in an economy like the United States. So from that leadership and cultural perspective, in the book, how do you frame the need or the process for creating these true leaders and creating people that can generate this sort of culture that's attractive from a working perspective?
It's a really good question again. Wow, Brett's got very good questions. This is great. So I'll frame this, and then I'm going to hand over to Joe pretty quickly. I think what underpins your question, and it's important, and it's language. Language is really interesting, right? Because language does impact how we think and how we behave. But there's and I'm going to use this term because it's a term that's still used, which is human resources, which sounds so crude to me.
Yeah, now. Human capital and human resources, like we're cattle. Yeah,
exactly. Very industrial age type of language. But one of the important human resource themes, and also coming from management, is this idea of attraction and retention. And the attraction and retention story or narrative, we talk a lot about narratives or authentic narratives in meaningful work. Part of that narrative is to say, well, how do we attract, or to be more specific, how do we attract talent and how do we retain talent? And I think a significant amount of that story, as you've indicated, has been about salary and what you're paying people. But I think not just younger people today, I think this is creeping into all age groups today, are beginning to say, well, hang on, we started with the question of the pandemic. It's created this enormous emotional or cognitive shift in people to say, maybe work isn't everything, or maybe perhaps even money, salary isn't everything. Maybe I need to, I'm not saying this in necessarily a deep or philosophical way, although we can go that way in this discussion.
No, I agree.
But there is a lot of thinking, rightly so, people to say, there has to be more to a place. If you're going to attract me to a geographical or a digital location, there has to be more to that place than just equal to KPIs and productivity and deliverables and transactions and process and outputs. And part of our story, and I will hand to Joe, part of our story, when we talk about, we've got a tool in Make Meaningful Work We've actually got two tools. One is called practice spotting, and the other one is called a Make Meaningful Work guided practice journal. But implicit and or explicit in both of those tools is this idea of a reflective practice. And so this idea is that what's missing in work today as a hangover from 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century industrial age work, because the industrial age has been with us for 200 years, is what's happened is we've got into this mode of transactional ways of working to a point where we have already become incredibly dehumanized and robotic as a result of that. And so what we're trying to explicitly promote and champion through the book is this idea of tools that enforce, in a way, in a nice way, or help people practice reflection equal to what we call soft skills, equal to what we call practices. Goes by different names: competencies, soft skills, practices, power skills. They're all the same things. But the idea is that we're deliberately and intentionally, we call it connect and contextualize. We're intentionally trying to connect the softer skills that are already implicitly at work all the time. It's happening on this call while we're talking. There's soft skills always at play. But what we're trying to do is connect that and map that to the hard skills equal to job roles, so that people start to put a lot more onus on the softer parts of work, but not to see that as necessarily a spiritual thing or a retreat thing or a yoga meditation thing. It's actually a very practical thing, but we have to put more emphasis on that, because that's what's going to go towards making these workspaces and, dare I say, these work practices more human. Jo, do you have some thoughts to share?
Yeah, I can give you another perspective, culture. So culture, we defined it as the interactions between the interactions and relationships between people, right? And the culture or the environment is made up of mainly three elements: the people, the time, and the place that you're in at that particular moment, right? And in terms of the weighting, like people is the most like important in that cultural role that you
Right,
play.
because if people have dysfunctional relationships, it's very difficult to
Exactly.
collaborate in a working environment.
Exactly right.
So I want to like quote a Confucius way of thinking and philosophy. So it's I put it in the book as well. It in Cantonese is 修身齊家治國平天下. So everything.
Okay.
You understand that.
My Canto's a little rusty, but momentai.
I just had this feeling that was coming from Brett. I don't know why. Love it.
Everything starts with the individual. So you need to continuously better and improve as an individual in terms of hard knowledge, your mindset and attitude, your values and your beliefs, and all these inner qualities within a person. Then you're more capable of managing or contribute to a family context. Then you can contribute more to your clan in the old ancient times. So
Sure.
it's
The tribe.
the family, the clan, the tribe. And then if you're capable and doing that well, you're qualified, or you're better equipped to managing the nation. So everything starts with the person. So that's why in our three pillars, it starts with the character building, and then the leadership, and then the culture.
Okay. So let's I mean, obviously trying to create flexible working structures, trying to accommodate these sort of different working styles, working from home or working from where you are. We have a lot of digital nomads now and so forth, adopting different working styles. How do you create this tight culture when you have people working away from each other in separate locations?
So we've thought about that as well, and it's actually more to share with you and the audience. It's a more recent insight, actually, because we've been at this implicitly and explicitly for a number of decades now, but more explicitly for 10 years in researching the book, which is a significant amount of time to invest. And that included, you know, speaking with, presenting to literally thousands of people. But what we were looking for is, I was describing it as the pointy end or the sharp end of the make meaningful work story. Like, what is it that we're really trying to do? What's the, I guess the cliche would be the rubber hits the road moment. And what we've come up with, and this is literally the last couple of months.
These cliches are a dime a dozen, man.
Oh, I've got a whole list here that I'm referring to, actually. So just throw them in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keep going.
A rolling stone gathers no moss.
Exactly.
So we're saying, what is it that we're really doing here? And how do we land it in a way that starts with character, that personalizes this and makes people feel that they're taking responsibility for the leadership and the culture, and they're inserting meaning into what they're doing? Because we're not talking about searching for meaning. We're talking about inserting meaning into what you do. And the three things we came up with is what we call the 3 M's, and they relate to the character, leadership, and culture. So what are they? The first M is motivators, right? So the idea is, why do I do what I do? Start with that. So a lot of people are, and we see this in Hong Kong, but it's not unique to Hong Kong. A lot of people, certainly in the industry that you know very well, in terms of finance and banking, there's a lot of people that are rocking up to work and doing their work, but they're probably not entirely clear on what motivates them to do so. So there's the motivator aspect of that. The second M, as part of the 3 M's, is moments. So that is, in practice spotting, there are 3 steps. One is record equal to a story. The second step in practice spotting is to reflect what's happening explicitly and implicitly. And the third step in practice spotting is a practice card equal to moving words to action, taking action. Within a story, there are moments. And you'll hear the word moments used quite a lot in sport. They'll talk about key moments in a game. So moments are really important. Moments are happening. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of moments happening within a person's day. But what's the key moments for you? And how do you then apply the practices, soft skills equal to those moments? And then the third M, Brett, is mindset and attitude. And so what are these 3 M's mean? What are they meaning to do? What do they equal? They equal what we call an authentic narrative. So what does that mean practically? It means that if we were to spend time working, say, in an in-person and or a distributed team, let's say the future of work says that it's going to be hybrid in some shape or form, we have to be really clear on what the 3 M's are for us individually, and also what those 3 M's are for us collectively. And that way, the idea here should be, the test of it should be, we shouldn't have to talk about culture or values and just talk about it. We should clearly understand collectively what our motivations are, what moments we're applying our practices, what it means for mindset and attitude equal to our collective authentic narrative. And that should be, in essence, the representation, or the iterative representation, of character, leadership.
Okay, but let's like actually delve into like the challenges of 21st century leadership, particularly in an environment where, you know, if we're going to be increasingly leveraging automation, then we have to be able to find human skills that differentiate from the pure processing and logic side. So you've already talked about the softer skills, but you know, from a cultural perspective, this is a big leap from where analytical skills, you know, project management skills, you know, highly technical skills have been more valued, particularly, say, you know, in the last 50 years in the, you know, information technology age. But, you know, we now got this flip where, well, things that you would have had to learn from a technical perspective, processing information, calculating spreadsheets, all this sort of stuff. That's all going to disappear because a machine will be able to do it better than you. But from a cultural perspective, this requires quite different organizational design at the heart of it. So what are the types of roles that are central to creating that type of culture then? What different from today? No, it's not a HR manager anymore, right? This is this is really about almost like a systems architect for people. So how in 20 years time, who is the architect of the culture of a business from a working practice perspective?
I'll talk to that briefly, then I'll hand over to Joe. I think it's a future question, clearly, and there's going to be a shift of titles and roles. But I'll pick one that I think is historic, present, and future, and that is a huge driver in Make Meaningful Work and underpinning is continuous learning and development. And so the idea is there must be a role, a chief role, or a distribution of putting responsibility and onus on the importance of constant learning and development. And if we're not providing the space for that, if we're going to continue to treat people like robots and continue to focus just on transactional stuff, it's going to have a brain drain, cognitive, emotional drain on work, and it's going to affect. It sounds self-serving to say so we can treat it as a hypothesis, but it's going to have a degradation on the competitiveness of businesses, because they're not focusing on the softer side or the spaces to create learning and development for people. So it comes back to the attraction retention. They're not going to attract the talent, and they're not going to be able to nurture the talent in it. So I would say, I don't know if it's a role or a series of roles associated with learning and development, but don't treat learning and development as a separate thing. Bake it in, codify it as part of 21st century work. Joe, go ahead.
I think we need to change the mindset and attitude on when we're hiring people. So for the past, 100, 200 years, is what skills you're bringing in
right
that I can exploit, basically. Right? So in exchange, I'll give you money.
Yes.
I think that's why we focus on the hard skills and we dehumanize ourselves.
Well, we don't, but workplaces do.
And
yes.
And the workers that work with us. And that is why we've seen so many decisions made that is so disconnected with ourselves and our nature.
Right.
And that's what's happening.
Right? So Joe, let me drill down on that a little bit and ask you a follow-up, which is, as we get more autonomous, smart economies, highly automated economies, and the nature of work changes, perhaps even where salary becomes disconnected from work, in that we might receive a universal basic income, for example, and then your work is no longer a job you do to put food on the table. Now you have a choice of what to do. This is sort of be an ideal environment, one would think, in the future for us to pursue things that we're interested and concerned about. When someone says, "What do you do?" instead of us describing something that puts food on the table and a roof over their heads, you can now talk about something you invested in. How do you see that process emerging, Joe?
I think when we've seen people that work on more softer skills as well. But if we learn soft skills the same way as hard skills, we're not reactivate all those senses that humans had, right? And that's why our tool is more on how do we open up the senses and the perspectives of people.
And connect and contextualize the practices in action.
Exactly. Because a lot of the times we keep talking about these soft skills, but not
applying it.
Yeah, not applying it and convert it into small actions that we can do. Because I think it's not either top down or bottom up type of structural change like when we study, it's like, oh, this organizational change and you need to prepare all these process. I think it comes from both sides, because of all these new young people, they don't see things as the factory ways of organizing things. And also, how can we get people to be more aware of each other's behavior? Because a lot of the times, I think these bad behaviors can exist in our world because we put up with it.
Because we let them, yeah.
Sometimes we don't even aware of it.
And right? Also,
and that we're trying to come together to think of a better term. Like, what's the contextual?
How do we find common purpose? Yeah.
The contextual plasticity of all of us. We need to bring that back.
Well, cognitive and contextual plasticity, and I'm watching the time. Cognitive and contextual plasticity, flexibility, adaptability, these are becoming more important.
Adaptability is certainly critical in an environment where things change so frequently, as the pandemic demonstrated. So if you're very rigid in your working practice as an organization or as an individual, you're screwed, right? So listen, guys, I know we've run out of time, but let me ask you this. Where can people find out more about the book and about the three pillars you spoke of, and some of the more practical aspects of generating meaningful work behavior and culture?
I think the best place to start is just go to, do people even say www anymore?
Yes, yeah, we do. It's allowed. Yes.
www.makemeaningfulwork.com. I'll repeat it without the R. www.makemeaningfulwork.com, and you'll see the book on the front cover on the homepage, and then and you'll be able to get the book on Amazon. Pardon me. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you both for joining the show. It's been a long time between drinks, as they say, but hopefully the book will do better than St Kilda's doing this year.
Well, I think if there's ever a universal truth, that's a universal truth. I think everything will be better than St Kilda next year.
All right. Well, listen, hey, Joe Wong and Dana Szuc, thanks for joining us on Breaking Banks. All the best for the book.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for having us.
Welcome to the Next Gen Banker podcast, where we explore what's next in banking and talk with the innovators responsible for creating positive change in the financial sector. I am your host, David Reiling, and I am super excited today to welcome Marilyn Waite. Marilyn, welcome to the Next Gen Banker podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Marilyn, I am absolutely fascinated with your work career and path. And I've seen it or understand that it ranges from Madagascar to France to China to the US. Can you tell us a little bit about your career and in sustainability, and in particular, your focus in sustainability finance?
Yes. My early training was as a civil and environmental engineer. So concrete, steel, water, wastewater, using more chemical processes. And so there was already an anchoring of environmental sustainability in those principles, in those concepts. I think what drove home more of the social sustainability side was when I spent time in Madagascar. So my first job from my first degree was in Madagascar, working on water resources with the United Nations in the more rural south of the country. And what happened was we went for a couple of months without reliable electricity. And that really shifted my focus towards both the private sector, private finance included, and also to clean energy, reliable energy, affordable energy, because I saw that without the electricity being reliable, the local businesses were shutting down, right? So refrigeration companies at that time, cyber cafes. I know we don't really think about cyber cafes anymore, but they were a thing at one point. And all of these things had an impact on the local economy. So that really caused the big shift. And from there, I started to work on sustainability and engineering in a more profound way, and then eventually entered the nuclear and renewable energy sector in France. And that's when ultimately, while I was working in R&D, technical economic studies, bringing new technologies to market, I found that a lot of our challenges were more on the finance and investment side than on the engineering or project management side. So that was another shift that I made through experience, really, and then shifted to China, shipped myself to China from France, and was working on a lot of things in China, and eventually came back to the States to lead a climate, clean tech, clean energy practice and a seed capital firm, which led me to what I'm doing today, which is I wear multiple hats. And my main hat is leading the Climate Finance Fund, which is philanthropically supported by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and hosted by the European Climate Foundation. And really, it's a strategy across those different geographies. So China, the European Union, and the United States, all about mobilizing capital through three primary pools of capital: venture capital, asset management, and of course, and most importantly, bank lending and credit.
Fantastic. And can I just ask you, when, from your perspective, when you think about sustainable finance from that global lens, how does the US compared to Europe, compared to Asia, how do you kind of think about those things in terms of maybe the geographics of who's progressing faster or slower?
Right. So I think even the term sustainability is quite rooted in a certain cultural norm that doesn't apply everywhere. So I think, for example, if when sustainability was being developed as a concept, right, as a phrase from the United Nations and other influencers, let's say, if China had been at that point, this major economy that it is today, I think maybe we would have used a different word or phrase. So, for example, I think in China, there's a lot more focus on health, on being healthy, right? And that comes from traditional Chinese medicine. It comes from all these other cultural influences. And I think that kind of health lens is one way in which people understand the concept within China. And you could say that about many parts of the world, but there's a certain angle and understanding of it that is pronounced in China more so than some other parts of the world. I think also there's a lot of different interpretations of what it means, and I think there's now in the United States what I've witnessed is a move towards this concept of regenerative economy, and that it's not good enough to sustain ourselves, but we also need to have this kind of circular regenerative improvement on things. And I think if you're talking about a more emerging or frontier market, a least developing economy, then maybe sustainability in the kind of very narrow way of thinking about it in terms of just keeping things going as they are is not the best word, because how they are is not okay, right? There's poverty and there's malnutrition, lack of access to markets and to goods and to services. And so actually sustaining is probably not the goal, right? And so I think there are definitely these kind of cultural differences. But overall, when I think about sustainability, I think about these four pillars, which I do think apply across. And these four pillars are social cohesion, kind of social sustainability, economic well-being, including financial well-being, financial health, environmental protection and well-being. So our ecosystems, everything that depends on the environment, which is our economy, right? So someone once said that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. And so very much that is a strong pillar of sustainability. And then finally, which I always like to incorporate, is this idea of future generations and future thinking. Because we could imagine, I mean, we often do actually, have a social, economic, and environmental system that can be quite myopic. And so sustainability pushes us forward to think about future generations beyond whatever is normal in our industry. So if we're used to thinking about 30-year terms, then we should think about 50-year terms. If we're used to thinking about, 2 to 5 years, we should push that boundary. And so beyond that, really, our Earth has been around and our ecosystem have been around for over, 3.8 billion years. And so we've been around for a very short time compared to that. And so if we think a bit more long term, I think we can go a long way.
Yeah, someone once told me that people really start to understand climate and climate impacts when they have grandchildren, because it really then gives them a window into a next generation or another century, and they begin to start to internalize the impacts of what they're doing. And so I always thought that was kind of a fascinating way to get people maybe to think more longer term. I have a question for you, because it's my understanding that you were able to attend the Global Climate Summit, COP26 in Glasgow. Were there any takeaways or any thoughts from that event that you could share with our listeners?
Yes, that was my first COP, and it may be my last COP. It's an interesting COP, right? It's a COP that's in the middle of a global pandemic. So there are many things about the COP. It's a COP that comes after the U.S. removed itself from the Paris Agreement and then put itself back in, and so there's lots of context behind this particular COP or Conference of the Parties, the big UN climate conference. And so I think there's a lot to unpack there about this particular convening. I think if this was your 26th COP, then you likely have a more nuanced perspective and probably, can list off the pros and the cons. This having been my first COP, I have a more critical perspective. And I was pretty disappointed in the outcomes, let's say. I thought that based on all of the recent studies and evidence that we have now, so from the IPCC, even from the IEA, the very conservative International Energy Agency, which pretty much said we cannot expand financing into fossil fuels for us to solve climate change, to keep life on Earth going in a livable way. And yet we didn't approach this, or I didn't see the outcomes that match that level of urgency and all of the evidence we have now that maybe wasn't at our same disposal before now. And so I think my recommendations for the next COP would be to definitely think about who's on the inside, actually at the negotiating table, and who's on the outside, and really have a different approach to be more inclusive of those like the youth, like the younger generations, who really have a big stake in this and really should be, for each delegation, there really should be a youth delegate who negotiates officially for their countries, right?
Yes,
That's not
I would
the case.
agree. Yeah. I would put my daughter right in the middle of that as well. I mean, just her perspective is just so much more passionate and urgent and sincere. I don't know how else to put it than others that I talk to. It is really very much a generational focus.
Right. And so I think that was part of what I witnessed as a challenge. And of course, it was also well documented that there were a lot of fossil fuel badges. So the fossil fuel industry, if it were a country, having more access, more voice than any single country. So that's problematic as well. I think that the reason why I attended this COP was because it was the first time that private finance or commercially oriented finance, however you want to call it, was on the table, was present, was a part of the conversation in a more serious way. And so that's why I was there. So I followed quite a bit of the finance and investment activity, which of course is not the core of official climate negotiations. I think that there has been progress, and that progress is not nearly close. I mean, even remotely close to what we need. Imagine if most of the banks who were present were B Corp banks.
Right.
Not the case. Not the case at all. Imagine if most of the banks present committed to phasing out fossil fuels in the next 5-10 years. Not the case. Or even, by 2050, also not the case. Imagine if most of the banks present and a part of the various commitments were truly diverse and inclusive and approached climate lending with a climate justice lens, right? So in addition to counting the carbon and counting emissions, also taking a look at, well, where, in terms of our footprint, where are we concentrating our emissions? Is it disproportionately in poor communities, in communities of color, in poor countries? Really look at the justice angle in addition to the pure climate impact or carbon impact angle. And so I think there's a lot of work to do. I have seen progress post-COP, however, in this notion of offsets. So I think going in, there was a lot of momentum around offsets are going to save us. Carbon offsets, I actually heard from a chairperson of a major European bank, a $1 trillion level, that we have to offset our way out of this problem and that we should plant oak trees. I mean, quite literally. I was just flabbergasted. I mean, it was, that was that was part of my
Wow.
disappointment. That's the kind of environment that I was in, right?
Yeah.
Global banking community and comments like that. And I will say now we even see Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, speaking about how actually, no, we cannot offset our way out of this.
Right.
We have to actually reduce our carbon emissions and those activities. We need the action plans to do that and decarbonize. And so I think, perhaps part of the silver lining is that there was so much kind of bad press, criticism over many parts of the COP that I think hopefully now there's a real reckoning happening and shifting in approaches.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And if I could take you one way to where banks are engaging, and while it's not the solution, I would say it's really the beginning of it all. Let's talk a little bit about PCAF and what's going on with the Partnership for Carbon Accounting for Financials. How do you see that, kind of in your own words, how do you kind of describe what PCAF is and what impact it can have?
Right. So PCAF started in the Netherlands among the Dutch pension funds and banks coming together to harmonize the approach by which they measure and disclose and reduce the carbon emissions of their loans and investments, right? So it's finance emissions. It's the core business of a bank, is to provide these loans and lines of credit. And so we had supported the global expansion and still do support the global expansion of PCAF to be a true partnership. So we helped to bring it to the United States and to other parts of the world. And what I'm proud of is that when we brought it to the United States, we were not dragged down by the laggards in the industry, meaning we started with the banks and the credit unions that have ESG in their DNA, so environmental social governance metrics in their DNA. So we started with the CDFI banks, credit unions, or the B Corp banks, the banks that are part of GABV, the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, for example. I mean, all of this ecosystem of values-based, ESG-oriented financial institutions, and we had held the line with those institutions in bringing it to the U.S. And then we brought in the laggards to come up to this level. Oftentimes, historically, what's happened is that I think there's a tendency to go with the largest bank or the largest financial institution and say, well, if we can get them on board to do this thing, then everyone else will join in, right? Given their size. And the truth is what happens, or what has happened in the past, is a lot is watered down and they bring down the ambition as opposed to coming up to an ambition. And so I think we were able to maintain the integrity of PCAF in this process. And I'm really proud of that. PCAF for each financial asset class provides a methodology to measure greenhouse gas emissions. It builds on the greenhouse gas protocol, which is also currently being updated, but is the foundation for carbon accounting in general for the non-financial companies. And it is comprehensive. So across auto loans, mortgages, commercial real estate, bonds, corporate loans, so on and so forth.
Yeah, perfect. And so, I mean, I can speak maybe from being each one of those, a member of the Global Alliance, as well as a B Corp bank and a CDFI. And we had submitted our data, Sunrise Banks, we submitted our loan portfolio data. I think we just got it back. We're looking at those results now. I think we got it yesterday, as a matter of fact. And we're gearing up to disclose in the first quarter. And then where I think for us, really where the rubber meets the road is, what's our strategy to act?
Right.
How do we get in alignment with the Paris Agreement? How do we engage with our clients? How do we engage or screen out certain loan portfolio class types and screen in others that we want to incent? And so it's really that, how do we get to action as fast as possible and really show a path forward for other banks and credit unions and financial cooperatives around the world that we can do this. But it is going to take commitment for one, and courage for another, in which to make a sizable and measurable impact and lead the way.
Right. Well, I'm excited for that. And I would love to hear how you strategize based on that data, because that is part of the effort, is to have that visibility first and then decide, okay, how to best act, right, to improve and bring down the emissions.
Exactly. And maybe in true Sunrise form, as kind of a social entrepreneurial organization, which happens to be a bank, we're going to make it up and we're going to figure it out. And some things are going to work and some things aren't going to work. But we've got to take the mindset of action as opposed to we're going to study this for another year. So we just kind of feel that sense of urgency to try things and lead. And if we fail, it's just a learning in disguise. And we're going to keep going and share what we learn with others so they don't have to make that mistake. So very much looking for a community, if you will, in PCAF financials to engage with. And that could be across the banking sector, insurance, obviously real estate finance, bonds, however it may be. There might be gleams of collaboration and knowledge that can be shared to accelerate all of us in the process. So if I could, Marilyn, I want to shift you a little bit into, well, I got to touch on this real quick because I'm a fintech kind of guy. How do you feel fintech plays a role in the environmental or the sustainable banking world, to lack of any better term?
So we funded a comprehensive landscape of this nexus between fintech and climate fintech, from New Energy Nexus, which is an accelerator and a clean energy support ecosystem for startups in clean energy and climate solutions. Globally, it started in California. It used to be called the California Clean Energy Fund, and now it's gone global, including with a presence in China and Uganda and Indonesia and other parts of the world. And New York, I guess, if we want to count that as another part of the world beyond California. And so the climate fintech landscape really, it was a breakthrough report in that it helped elucidate what we mean by climate fintech, what are the various verticals, including reg tech and insure tech, and all the ways you can utilize technology and financial technology for some type of climate end. And there has been a lot of movement there. We also funded the first Cards and Payments Challenge, so kind of a mini accelerator in climate fintech, where we were able to provide non-dilutive funding to startups who were innovating in climate fintech through New Energy Nexus, of course. And so, everything from Accountable, which is a U.S. Do you know Accountable?
Yep.
It's a U.S.-based app, so everyone can download it. It brings transparency to any transaction that you do. So you safely link your bank card or whatever you use to do most of your purchasing, and you also choose your what's most important to you. So, for example, is it gender equity, racial equity, climate action, supporting local businesses, things of that nature. And you can, like me, choose like everything's very important, 5 out of 5 on everything, the strictest. So, but you have that flexibility. And then based on that, they will also bring transparency to not only the scoring of what you are purchasing and the company behind that, but also where they're drawing their data from, because there's a lot of different databases and ways of approaching this broader ESG landscape. And so I recently found out when I was stopped at one of the kind of book stands in Union Station in Washington, D.C., so near the Amtrak in the Amtrak station. And from the app, I learned that was not aligned with my goals on gender equality in particular. And they also propose alternatives. And it turns out Wawa is like one of the best alternatives, according to what I find to be ESG aligned. And so that kind of information I would have never gotten, right, otherwise.
Oh, that is fantastic. And it was the one thing that struck me the most about that Climate First report was the power of fintech and data and how it can be used so quickly in which to provide feedback and change behavior. And it is really somewhat of the magic of fintech is it's obviously digital. And as a result of that, when used, I think, responsibly and appropriate, particularly with AI, you can really get some powerful information quick and make decisions accordingly of I'm going to shop here or buy here or eat here as opposed to somewhere else. And not to mention really giving you that feedback on those things that you're most concerned about, whether it's environmentally or socially. And so, yeah, really fantastic. So
yes, absolutely.
I would love to switch. You wrote a book, Sustainability at Work, and Careers That Make a Difference. And one of the things about the Next Gen Banker podcast is really the ability to get this conversation out to, I'll say, people interested in finance, but also very much ingrained from a values standpoint of that social environmental aspect. Tell me a little bit about what was your motivation for writing the book in the first place? And were there any kind of little bit of ahas as you were going through the development of the book process?
Right. So I had studied engineering for sustainable development. And then when I started to work in the field, so in a nuclear spent fuel recycling plant in France, I remember having a particular conversation. I was working a night shift as a safety operations engineer. And I was speaking with a fellow engineer about what I had studied, and civil environmental engineering, easy enough. And then when it came to this sustainable development thing, sustainability thing, it was just mind-boggling for my fellow colleague. And I realized, but for me, I was completely doing the work. I was improving operationally, looking to improve on the waste and reducing the chemical use in the plant. And for me, it was like a no-brainer. Yet I think I was living in a bubble around, everyone else around me was also studying this. And so what I wanted to do by writing this book is really bring to more people the fact that you can integrate sustainability in almost any job and career path. And if we're going to solve some of our major challenges like climate change, then we actually have to. We actually don't even have a choice. We need to get the system going. And that requires not just what we can do, when we're at home, but what we can do when we're at work.
Yeah, definitely. And whether it was interesting. I haven't read the book yet. I scanned the contents page, and you're right. No matter whether you're a teacher, a banker, or a lawyer, you can ingrain sustainability into everything in every lens. And as you mentioned, we have to. It's just the mindset we need to shift. So if I can press you on the next gen banker question. So when we think about what does the next generation of banker look like, what comes to mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it definitely looks colorful, like more heterogeneous. The next gen banker, as you were saying, is more innovative. I think leaning into the tech, doesn't shy away from tech, user friendliness. I think also when I say innovation, also, for example, structuring green loans that don't have the same track record as fossil fuels. And for some projects, no track record at all. I think bankers can apply a framework that I developed called SURF, which is in the book. SURF stands for Supply Chain, User Relationships, and Future Orientation. And I think applying this framework was also very helpful in for the next gen banker. I think tracking the carbon emissions, reducing those emissions, tracking human capital and demographics, and reducing the bias, all of these things I think have to be part of the toolkit of the next gen banker. I would encourage more syndication. So one way of managing, if we're going to take on more innovation, more tech, some might hear, oh, more risk. Well, maybe we can manage that risk by partnering and syndicating. And then I would like to see more banks become B Corp banks or equivalents. And I think there's such potential, right? In the United States alone, there's over 5,000 banks and over 5,000 credit unions. Of course, there's been a lot of consolidation. However, there's a lot to work with in terms of ingraining more sustainability into banking and lending. One thing I'll just say, because of your audience, one of my pet peeves is just the amount of inefficiency that I see happening, especially among the ESG-oriented banks. So, for example, oftentimes there isn't a foreign currency desk dedicated to a ESG-aligned bank or a sustainable bank. And then the bank has to rely on some other unsustainable bank for certain services. Well, what if all the good banks got together and source their own back end for international transactions and foreign currency? I think there's a lot of that kind of thing. I think the credit union industry does some of that pretty well. I would love to see it on the banking side and just kind of, use that collective nature and that alignment. And so, yes, maybe sometimes you compete. Often not, though. Oftentimes you don't really. It's different markets, different strategies. But even still, if you look at the largest 6 banks in the U.S., there's a lot of syndication, a lot of collaboration, and it would seem to me that we could have even more impact if there would be that kind of efficiency gains in collaborating.
Well, Marilyn, we are so on the same page, particularly in regards to that issue, because I was just talking about it about a couple of weeks ago within the context of the GABV and what correspondent banking could look like for the organization as a whole and its members. So we're on it. We're trying to get it done.
Yay.
So Marilyn, thank you so much for joining today. Your insights have been super valuable, and how we can use banking and finance as a force for good and for sustainability. Again, thanks for all you do out there, and appreciate you being on the podcast.
That's it for this week. If you like the show, make sure to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, or share it with a friend, or share it on social media.
We'll see you again next week with more Breaking Banks.